Hi, everybody. Hi, welcome. We're just going to continue to let a few people just sort of load in, and then we'll get kicked off with the webinar today. Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, well, if we're ready, let's get started. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the webinar that we're hosting today, which is evaluating ISO 27001 versus SOC 2 Type 2. So this is going to be a bit of a focus on the differences between these two standards and sort of how to choose which one is best for your organization. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We're going to be recording this session, so if you have to drop off at any point or you miss a bit, don't worry, we will be recording, and we'll send the recording background afterwards. Don't worry if you miss anything. Please make sure, just in case you're muted, unless you're going to be answering a question. Otherwise, I'm very easily distracted. And if you want to ask any questions, you can do that either at the end. We're going to have a sort of designated Q&A bit portion of the presentation, or you can just drop a question kind of in the chat box as you go, and we'll kind of pick it up as we go along. We're also going to be adding a feedback link into the chat box towards the end of the session. So if you do get a minute, please take a moment to fill that in, as it really helps us kind of improve our webinar series, gives us new ideas for what people want to be hearing. So let's get started. Brilliant. So welcome. If you haven't attended one of our webinars before, this is a series on security and DocTech are hosting, which is designed to improve our clients' understanding of sort of cybersecurity certifications and the backgrounds behind them. So my name's Beth. I'm the product manager here at On Security. If you don't know On Security, we're an offensive cybersecurity company specializing in manual pen testing. We've got my colleague Liv, who's helping on the call with the sort of questions and the managing the call for us today. And we also have Alistair Goodwin here from DocTech. So I will hand over to you, Al. Please give us a brief introduction of yourself and what does DocTech do?
Brilliant. Thanks, Beth. Al Goodwin. I'm the CEO and co-founder here at DocTech. We founded DocTech around 4 years ago, and DocTech was founded to help SMEs achieve information security certifications in an efficient manner. And by achieving those certifications, help those SMEs get to contract faster. So that's me. Prior to DocTech, I spent about 20 years in financial services technology and turning around distressed fintechs. So that's me. That's my background.
Brilliant. Then can you give us a quick sort of overview about what DocTech is as an organization and what you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started about 4 years ago. Primary objective is to help firms achieve certifications such as Cyber Essentials, SOC 2, ISO 27001. There's many of them out there, but make that whole process more efficient. So traditionally, firms would go to a consultant and pay a large sum of money, typically on a time and materials basis, to help achieve those certifications. We've taken very much a tech-first approach to it. So we provide a platform, and we also support that with a managed service. So we have platform and people to help people both achieve certification and also maintain certification in a much cheaper, more efficient manner. So that's us. There are 3 co-founders, been going 4 years, and that's us. Yep.
Brilliant. Cool. So let's just have a quick run through what we're going to be covering today. So some of you might have already been on our previous webinar that we did, which was a kind of focus around understanding ISO 27001. But once we'd done that webinar, we had a bit of a conversation with some of our clients, and they wanted to know, how do SOC 2 Type 2 and ISO 27001 differentiate, and how can they choose which one is best for them as an organization? So kind of before we get into the details, first off, we're going to cover off the first point, which is, well, do I actually need a certification? Secondly, we're going to look at a bit of an overview of both of the standards, how they're similar, where they're different. Then we're going to look at how, once we've uncovered that, how do we actually decide which one is right for you as an organization? And then we're going to move on to, say you've already decided which one you're going to go for, how can you make meeting the criteria as easy as possible? So that's kind of what we're just going to cover very briefly. And so just to start us off, really, I think a lot of organizations probably think this: you hear a lot about sort of cybersecurity certifications all the time, but if you're an organization, as most of us are, with kind of really limited time and obviously budget, I guess the first question is, how do you know if you should really be doing one? So I guess I'll sort of kick this over to you. How do you start this conversation with your potential clients when they come to you with this question?
So we talk about a cybersecurity journey, different stages, and depending upon the nature of your business, size, the technology you're using, and primarily the kind of sector and customers you're selling to, will dictate where you get to in that journey. So we talk about secure, certify, and scale. Now, it doesn't matter what size company you are, what you're doing, whether you're a plumber, whether you're a hairdresser, or whether you're a multinational fintech, you need to start by ensuring you've got the cyber essentials in place. And when I say cyber essentials, I'm not referring to the actual certification. I mean the fundamentals. Yeah, exactly. The fundamentals you need to secure the data that you contain. So in that example, whether you're a plumber or a hairdresser, you are still likely to be capturing personal information that you want to protect. So it doesn't matter what business, start by ensuring you have the basic security in place. And that's the things like, ensuring you've got multi-factor authentication in place, ensuring you've got firewalls set up, ensuring you've got some kind of mobile device management tool in place. So it's all those very basic things you need to do to protect your business and the data, your business data. Now, depending on the sector you're in and what you're doing is then going to dictate whether you go to the next stage, i.e., do you need to certify? Now, we always say to customers, typically, particularly if you're an SME, we wouldn't bother certifying unless your customers are demanding it from you. So despite me wanting 1,000 more people to, I would love it if everybody wanted to certify because it'd be great for my business. However, the reality is not everybody needs to do it. So you should only really do it typically if you're being asked to do it, or you've got to a stage in your business growth where actually having those processes and procedures in place in a formalized manner will help you as a business. From an operational perspective, because there is a certain point at which in any business is going to get to in their growth where actually you're going to need more processes in place, and therefore actually following a certification or a framework may help you achieve that. So yeah, I would, as I say, and then onto the next stage we talk about is, okay, let's say you are certified. Now you need to think about how you ensure that as your business grows and your business scales, your information security costs don't scale with it. Mm-hmm. And that's all around automation and thinking about automating as much as possible.
So I guess going kind of back on what you said as a sort of first point. So is the main difference for companies, is it kind of between whether you as a company are either just holding data or providing a service or software, for example?
Yeah. So if you think as the example I gave before, if every company is going to be retaining some form of data, even if it's just your staff data, and therefore you're going to need to ensure that you're complying with GDPR and things along those lines, as well as ensuring you've got those basic cybersecurity controls in place. Whereas if you are providing, let's say, a SaaS service where you're actually holding a customer's data and you're processing the data on their behalf, then they are almost definitely going to require or want you to demonstrate that you're doing the right things by them. And what that means is you'll need to have that independent verification that you're controlling and you're securing their data. So that's when you need to typically certify. Now, for some of the basic certifications that are out there, and we'll touch on these in a little bit more detail, things like Cyber Essentials, the driver there is going to be, well, are you selling into a UK government organisation? So Cyber Essentials is a UK government-backed certification. If you want to sell into any UK government organisations, you need to be Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus certified. If you then move on to things like ISO and SOC2, the driver is going to be that your customers are, they're expecting it of you. So if you're a SaaS company processing data on behalf of your clients, they're going to expect it of you, and if they don't expect it of you, it's going to be a big driver for sales, right? It may differentiate your business versus others when it comes to sort of the sales process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Brilliant. Okay, so for anybody who's kind of not familiar, then it's probably worth if we just give a bit of an overview of each of the standards and kind of what they do. So let's if we start off with kind of just really, really generally, what is ISO 27001?
Okay, it will be quick because I mean we could spend an hour just discussing ISO 27001 and SOC 2 or more than an hour. So I'll keep it quick. So as it says in the slide here, it is kind of the gold standard for information security. It's an internationally recognized standard. So if you're a European international business, this is typically what you'd be expected to have in place. Now, in order to achieve ISO 27001, you need to build, as it says in the slide, this information security management system. If we just flip onto the next slide, I think we'll talk a little bit through what that actually means. So in order to build an information security management system, you need to assess the risks that your business has and then implement controls to manage those risks. And then you need a process in place where you reassess those risks and you improve those controls on a continuous basis to manage those risks. So at a very high level, that's really what it is. It's about thinking about the risks. What controls am I going to put in place to manage those risks? Yeah. And then having a process in place where you continually assess that risk and improve the controls you have in place.
That's the next slide, I guess, here. Yeah. So what does it involve?
And then I think the thing that with ISO is that you'll need to assess, there are just over 90 controls within the standard that you need to consider whether or not they're applicable to your business. So you go through an assessment, are they applicable? Yes, okay, I need to implement them. Once you have your information security management system in place, you have your controls up and running, you're doing your quarterly security management meetings, you've done an internal audit, then you'll be ready to do an external audit with a UCAS accredited certification body. So what will happen is the external audit will come in. The initial audit in year one will be split into two stages. Stage one, where they'll come and look at all the documentation, policies and procedures that you have in place to ensure it complies with the standard. Stage two of the audit will be when they typically, if you've got an office, they'll come on site and they'll ask you questions. They'll want to capture evidence that you are actually doing the things you've said you've done and you are complying with the standard. Now, with all of these certifications, there is a level of flexibility. The controls you have in place and how you implement them, to a large extent, is up to you. It's based upon the specific risks your business face. So whilst there's a 90-odd controls that ISO 27001 asks you to consider, you don't actually have to implement all of those controls. And in many cases, you would be expected to implement other controls that are specific to your business and the risks that you face.
So it's about the business context then, yeah.
Exactly that. So then once you've been through stage one and stage two, all being well, you'll be recommended for certification and you will get a certification. And then a year later, you'll need to do a surveillance audit. And again, that will be a process where the external auditor comes in and assesses whether or not you're continuing to comply with the standard. Are you continuing to do all the things you said you've done in your policies? Are you continuing to have those quarterly management meetings, those annual internal audits? Are you continuing to consider the risks and how they've changed and therefore implemented new controls? And that's really the 3-year kind of loop for ISO 27001.
And then how does that kind of relate to, there's obviously more than one ISO 27000 and ISO standard as a whole. You know, there's ISO 27002, I should imagine. How do they relate to each other?
So there are hundreds of ISO standards. If you think about the common ones that customers in this kind of space would do, it would typically be 27001. They'll also quite often do something called 9001 at the same time. That's what we call it, is a quality management system. It's quite closely linked to 27001, so lots of customers will do it at the same time. And that's really there to demonstrate, again, you have quality management processes in place, that you're doing the right thing by your customers. And it's another way of building trust with customers, which ultimately is what this is all about. It's like, okay, I'm not going to buy from you as a supplier unless I have confidence in your business. It's great if you can demonstrate that to me and demonstrate that someone independent has come in externally and verified you're meeting certain standards. So yes, there are actually hundreds there. And there's, I guess the ones that are coming into trend are things like this, obviously some environmental standards out there. There's an AI standard on the way as well. So there's a number of additional standards that are more and more firms are starting to adopt.
Not all related to security, just kind of any.
Oh, no. ISO covers, you name it, it covers it. There's a standard out there for it.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. So we've covered off a bit of the ISO side of things. So let's go forward now and kind of have a look at the SOC 2 Type 2 specifically is what we're talking about. Let's have a quick overview of that one, please.
Okay, so SOC 2 originated in the US by AICPA, so that's the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. For those of us in the UK and Europe, you'll probably be more familiar with CIMA, so the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. They actually merged with the AICPA, so they're an accountancy body, and traditionally they'd have been carrying out audits on your financial statements, so we're all probably familiar with that. So what they developed SOC to do is actually for those auditors to carry out and assess the operational effectiveness of your security controls. So they developed this in 2010, and it's changed recently. There's been a few iterations. But ultimately, SOC 2 it's a US bias framework for auditors to conduct an audit on your security. It's primarily used, as it says in the slide, for particularly a little bit like ISO27001. It's primarily used if you're storing, transmitting, processing data on behalf of someone else. Now, more recently, that's obviously a lot of that's done in the cloud. So it's particularly popular with sort of, data center providers, SaaS companies, software companies that are doing that. They're processing data on behalf of the customer. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit more focused, I would say, on the cloud side of things, and very popular with SaaS companies.
Makes sense.
In terms of the way in which, what does it involve, the SOC 2? So as I mentioned, it's an audit. What you'll go through is an observation period during which the external auditor will be collecting evidence from your business. And at the end of that period, they will attest and write a report, very much like a financial report and a financial audit, on whether or not you're compliant with those controls. The great thing with the SOC 2 report is it's a report rather than a certification. So and it has quite a lot of detail in it.
SOC 2 Type 2 is the name of the report then, is it?
It is. It's the type of report that's generated, exactly that. So unlike ISO 27001, where you get a certificate and you can stick that somewhere in so everyone can see that you've got a certificate, you don't actually get much detail typically from an ISO 27001 client on what was actually involved, what controls you have in place. Whereas the SOC 2 Type 2 report is quite detailed. And what you will then do is share that, typically under NDA, with your customers and stakeholders, so they can read in quite a lot of detail the controls you have in place, how you've implemented it, and based upon the auditor's opinion, how you've met those controls. That period during which they will be collecting evidence from you is known as the observation period. It varies typically from 3 to 12 months. Now, if you work in, let's say, a regulated industry, you're likely to be expected to do a 6 or 12 months observation period. Smaller companies or those just starting will quite often have just start with a 3-month period.
So it's more likely that if you're sort of a financial services organization, then you're expected to be able to demonstrate that.
Yes, exactly that. So if you're a fintech, you'd be expected to do a sort of a 6 or 12 months observation period, or if you're a larger company.
And then kind of in the same way that we mentioned about the kind of other ISO standards, did the other SOC standards relate to this one? Do you have to go through those before you can go for your SOC 2 Type 2 report, or not?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So do we have to, if you're an organization, do you have to kind of work your way through the standards, or can you just go straight for I just want to go to SOC 2 Type 2, I don't need to go for SOC 2 Type 1 first, for example?
Yeah, so it's probably worthwhile touching on the different types of SOC 2 reports. So a SOC 2 Type 1 report is a point-in-time assessment of the controls you have in place. The auditor will come in and they'll comment on the controls you have in place at that period of time. It's not an observation of whether they're operationally effective. So a SOC 2 Type 1 report is useful if you very quickly need to demonstrate you've got some controls in place, but you don't have time to demonstrate that they're actually effective. So to be honest, most customers will go directly for a SOC 2 Type 2 report because it holds a lot more weight with your customer, because he's actually saying, okay, you've not just got these controls, but actually they are effective. And I can read a lot more detail around how they are or not effective.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Brilliant. Okay, so we've kind of covered this, I guess, just generally, but just to really, really drill down, where do these key certifications overlap? It sounds like there's quite a lot, but we've sort of pulled out the kind of main one, Tim.
Yes, so in terms of the things you actually need to do, so I don't know, you need to do background checks when someone starts, or you need to ensure your S3 buckets on AWS are encrypted at rest, those type of things that you actually need to do to secure your customers' data and your business data. They're pretty much exactly the same, right? There's very little difference in the underlying things you need to do. The big difference is really in the audit process right. And the way in which you determine which controls are applicable for your business. Mm-hmm. So, for example, ISO, as I mentioned, there's 90 odd controls in the latest version of ISO 27001 that you need to assess and determine whether they're applicable for your business. SOC 2 doesn't have that list of controls. They do have what they call sort of points of interest, and they have some guidance that you can use to determine whether, you know, that will help point you in the right directions of the controls you should have in place. But it's more flexible in terms of the controls that you have in place. So, but ultimately, if you've considered your risk appropriately, the list of controls you implement are going to be the same, because they're ultimately trying to achieve the same thing, which is protect your data, protect your customers' data, build trust with their customers. So that, yeah, the objective is very, very similar.
In, I guess, yeah. And then, so you've got the same sort of objectives, which is what you just covered. Mm-hmm. The processes and all controls are the things that you do to help achieve those objectives. And then you have the third point, which is kind of evidencing the fact that you are doing those processes and controls.
Yeah, and that is one significant difference is the way in which you capture the evidence. So if you think of an ISO 27001 audit, the auditor will, as I say, will typically turn up at your office and they'll start asking questions, and they'll say, okay, you have this control in place that says when John Smith started last month, you did some background checks. They'll say, well, show me that you did that. I'd like to see some evidence. They'll ask you for it at the time. And that's typically going to be, for a small company, you know, between 3 and 5 days, that sort of that initial audit, where they'll be asking for evidence of all these things. Whereas with a SOC 2 audit, it could typically and quite often be a 6-month period during which you've got to be able to collate and provide evidence on a continuous basis to the audit. Now, it's not normally every day, but they will regularly ask you to provide evidence that you're doing these things. So the amount of evidence you need to collate for SOC 2 is greater. Right. And as a result, the kind of the focus on how you manage and collate that evidence, that's why people tend to use automated systems to do that. Whereas with ISO 27001, you can have collated all the evidence, but when the auditor comes in, the time that audit takes is going to be dictated by UCAS, who they report to, rather than the actual time they need to spend. So what do I mean by that? They could, based upon the complexity of the company, they might be told under their rules that they need to spend 5 days auditing you for an ISO 27001 audit. And they're going to spend 5 days there because they may leave to their own accreditation if they're not meeting those kind of things. So they're going to have to spend. So the fact you've collated all this and you can answer their questions immediately isn't going to speed up the audit. Probably going to mean actually they just ask you more questions to fill up the time over 5 days. Whereas with a SOC 2 audit, it's a certified public accountant that does it, and they're typically charging you on a sort of time and materials type basis. So if you've collated all this evidence and you can provide it to them in a more effective, efficient manner, the time they spend is a lot lower and the cost of the audit goes down a lot.
That's interesting. Well, that kind of leads me on to my next question, really, which is, probably the main question that everyone wants to know is, what's the kind of difference in, well, two-factor kind of, resource cost? How much do each of these cost me from a time perspective, and how much do these cost me from a financial perspective? Is there sort of significant differences?
It's going to, people, if you look at the materials and the feedback from the firms in sort of, I guess, North America who start with SOC 2, they always think ISO is harder. Right. And then if you start with the people that in Europe and the rest of the world that sort of start with ISO and then go to SOC 2, typically, they always think SOC 2 is harder. It's kind of from my experience, there is actually getting ISO and getting your information security management system up does take a little bit of time, but actually a lot of that you should be doing for SOC 2 anyway.
Sure.
So there's very little difference. So in terms of the actual time it takes you as a business to commit to this, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference in total time. The big difference is the time, as I mentioned, it takes to get to the actual audit, because you've got this long observation period and a huge evidence collection requirement. That is much higher for SOC 2 than it is for ISO, where you just know a few days a year you need to be able to provide this evidence to the auditor. So I'd say SOC 2's, I would personally, I would think it's a greater effort required to achieve SOC 2, but there's lots of debate around that. In terms of the costs, there's no debate. ISO 27001 is a cheaper certification to achieve because the audit fees are that much lower. So SOC 2 Type 2 audits tend to be considerably more expensive than an ISO 27001 audit.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess just generally to kind of round up what we've got on the slide here. So we mentioned before that you've got your ISO, when you've done your ISO certification, you get a certification, but when you do finish your SOC 2 period, you're getting a report basically. So
yeah, that's right. So yeah, certification by your certification body, whoever that might be. There's about a dozen UCAS accredited certification bodies in the UK. They'll provide you with a certificate that you can put on your website and those type of things. Whereas the SOC 2 Type 2 report, typically what people will do is they'll provide that through the procurement process, and quite often on their website, but they'll put it behind some kind of NDA, because with the SOC 2 Type 2 report, there's quite a lot of confidential information in there you wouldn't want to share with someone without there being an NDA in place. There is actually a SOC 3 report, which focuses on, it's kind of a high level version of a SOC 2 report with no confidential information in it, and it's designed primarily for marketing, so people really just can put it on their website, and it's an open public document. Right. So it's a summary sort of document of the SOC 2. It's called SOC 3.
That's interesting. Brilliant. Okay, cool. So let's move on to our next section. So we've kind of done our bit of a whistle-stop tour of what each standard is. So I guess bearing this all in mind, people probably generally, if you're listening to this, you probably think, okay, well, this one kind of sounds like it's more suited to our business. But if you get to that point when you're going through this process with a client, how do you then, and they don't kind of know which one they think they should be going for, how do you kind of then advise them on what the next step should be?
It's exactly this slide. Where's your primary clients? So if you're Europe International, start with ISO 27001, and then if you're growing into and start selling into North America, then go to SOC 2. Mm-hmm. And vice versa. If you're North America, they're all going to start with SOC 2. And then they're going to probably, once they start moving internationally, then going to start adopting ISO 27001. So client's going to be the driver. They'll tell you what they want. Quite often, and in most industries, if you've got one or the other, they'll accept it. You don't often have to have both. If you start moving into more regulated type environments, health tech, fintech, if you're one of those type of companies, they may well ask for both. Once, particularly, obviously, if you're starting to sell into internationally and in North America.
I was going to ask actually about the kind of regulation side of things. Does that generally tend to have much of an impact of which one you go for from a starting point, other than the kind of location element?
Not really, no.
It's more about
primarily it's going to be your customers and what they expect of you. What is it that they recognize, will understand, and it's going to help you build trust, help you get through procurement, help you get to contract with that customer faster. That's going to be your primary driver, as I say, because the underlying things you actually do are very similar. So from a business perspective, and there's clearly benefits to, protecting your own business and sort of revenue protection, cyber incident or some kind of data privacy incident is going to be potentially catastrophic to an SME. So there are clear benefits to your business aside from sales, but 99% of the time, right, it's sales that are driving people to us because they've been told, right, you need ISO 27001, you need SOC 2, you need to be compliant with this certification, that certification, or we won't touch you.
Yeah. So it's probably you're gonna get a feeling from that way anyway, because you're going to get people coming to you and saying people are asking us about this particular certification.
And there, I mean, there are loads out there. There's many other standards. There is no standard. Unfortunately, life would be a lot easier for everyone if there were a single standard. They all have their pros and cons, but largely they're all trying to achieve the same thing. And the best recognized now, ISO27001 and SOC2, I say, it's become increasingly popular. It's only been around since 2010, but it's increasingly popular. And increasingly it's the case that customers will expect it rather than you kind of, so if you're thinking about expanding into North America and selling internationally, then you need to kind of work back on a timeline basis. Think about how long is it going to take you. If you're going to do a 6-month observation period, you need to add a couple months to that to prepare, and you need to add a couple months for them to actually write and issue the report as well. So you pretty much need a 12-month period to get a SOC2 Type 2 report in place. With ISO, it may not be quite as long, but you still need to think at least sort of 6 months backwards, because typically it takes a company 3 months to prepare. If you're an SME, we'd say if you can spend a bit of time each week on this, you need around roughly 3 months if you're a standard SME. And then you've got your internal audit, then you've got your stage 1, then you've got your stage 2. So again, typically 6 months. It can be done faster, but you'll have to drop everything else and it will not be a pleasant experience. Not that any of this is that pleasant for most people, because most people don't want to get involved. People don't want to do it, but it's a requirement for sales.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, cool. So in our sort of little hypothetical example that we're using here, so you've gone through, you've had that conversation with your customer and said, yeah, okay, right, we know which one we're going to go to. What I guess most people probably want to move on to then is how do I make sure that I'm meeting the criteria, and also kind of how am I meeting the criteria as easily as possible and sort of as cheaply as possible, I should imagine, unless you're that way inclined to spend loads and loads of money. But yeah, what's the kind of main thing that you'd suggest in terms of making it as easy as possible?
So I wouldn't suggest that you go and buy the standard and try and work your way through that.
Unless you
I've had the pleasure. Yeah, exactly. And I've had that pleasure. I've read through the standards and the documentation. Not many people are going to enjoy that experience. I wouldn't suggest you do that. There are plenty of providers out there. We're one of them. Go to a provider. They will give you quite clear steps on that you need to go through. So, we have clear steps and a workflow you can work through to achieve and prepare for each of the standards. We have a lot of support materials on, if you're an AWS hosted or GCP hosted sort of service, the sort of tools and processes you can put in place. And one of the things worth noting is there's a lot of stuff out there that's free or cheap these days. So there's lots of things you need to do, right? You need security awareness training in place. You don't need to spend a huge amount of money on it. There are new great tools out there. Like you guys, like people need, if you're going to do a pen test or a vulnerability test, actually, there are modern tools out there like the ones that you guys provide on security that's a far more efficient, cost-effective way of managing and delivering on some of these requirements for these standards. So there are lots of things you can do out there that perhaps in the past weren't done. So yeah, I think go to one of the providers that will give you a clear steps, and ideally has an automated platform. So it's not just about preparing for the audit. It's about then the ongoing maintenance of compliance. So once you get your certification or your SOC2 report, it doesn't end there. It's a continuous process. Now that's the bit that people forget. They just, I've got my certificate, and then try and forget about it for 12 months. Well, it's not the case. And if you don't have, exactly. Yeah. And then everyone, they dash around sort of a few weeks before the next surveillance audit. The reality is it's much easier and more efficient if you do have a platform in place that's going to help you manage, monitor, share out the workload and ensure that you're remaining compliant. And that's where, companies like us really will benefit in terms of reducing your ongoing costs. In our case, we have integrations with many other platforms so that you can automatically run tests each day to ensure that you're remaining compliant. That evidence is captured. It makes the whole process far more efficient. So I would definitely look for an automated solution. But I'd also,
will these sort
I'd
of
also
automated
highlight.
solutions be able to help with, say, if you're like you mentioned before that you're sort of specifically AWS hosted, for example, will they be able to recognize that and, you know, provide you the relevant controls that you need to?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the example, I think we used it earlier, sort of, are your buckets encrypted at rest? You know, your S3 buckets and AWS encrypted at rest. So in our example, yeah, we've got tests that run each day to ensure that they are, and you get notified if they're not, and your control effectively goes amber, and you get alerted. By the way, something's gone wrong. Or if someone joins your organization and you know you haven't done a background check, if you're using our automated integrations through to firms like Verimark, where we can connect and check that background check's been done, we'll automatically notify you if you're no longer meeting that control. So Jenny didn't do a background check, the control's going to go amber, you're going to get alerted. So that will save you a lot of time. But I would, on the side of caution, because everyone talks about automation, and you know, we talk about it, we sort of talk about the future of compliance is being automated, but the reality is you do need some support, particularly if it's the first time you've done this. So it's great having this wonderful platform, but you do need some support. You need someone you can talk to. So I would also say, if you're going down this route, platforms are great, but make sure you've got some expertise. On the opposite scale of that, I wouldn't go down the process that traditionally people have done and gone, compliance, I'm not interested, someone else deal with it. I'm just going to hire a consultant on a time and materials basis. What will quite often happen then is they will build a very difficult to manage and expensive sort of framework. And then as your business grows, you'll have to just keep employing more and more information security staff. Right. And they won't really be doing much beyond compliance monitoring. And it's going to cost you an awful lot of money at a time when CISOs are extremely expensive and in demand. So, yeah, I wouldn't go down that route either. It's finding a balance between...
you don't want to encourage people just to be doing it purely for the tick box exercise as well. It's building either building habits that you don't already have, or using good habits that you do have, making it as easy as possible to kind of demonstrate that information to an auditor.
Yes, exactly that. So it's finding that balance kind of based on your organization of using these sort of automated tools and getting this support and experience you require, and having someone you can rely on to, you know, pick up the phone to if you need assistance. I think it's finding that balance is appropriate. I wouldn't go down the full consultancy route, and I wouldn't go down the full platform route. I think finding a balance is the ideal scenario for most SMEs.
So if you're, I know we obviously have a lot of clients that are doing regular pen tests, regular vulnerability scans. If they're already doing these activities, can they use these as evidence?
Yes, absolutely. So rather than manually having to go and capture evidence that you collate in preparation for an audit, you can use these automated integrations, so API connections into security, and we'll capture and monitor the fact that your ongoing vulnerability scanning is coming on, and also can capture evidence that a pen test report has been carried out as well. So it's all collated in the platform. So when the auditor arrives, it's they have the evidence. And you know that, you know, it's much easier than from an internal perspective to monitor and check that you've done all the things you need to do.
Yeah, I guess it's about minimizing the kind of unnecessary steps between the kind of two activities of the actual providing of the evidence in you know, pen test or vulnerability scan format, and the showcasing the evidence for the auditors. It's kind of making that as streamlined as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. If you think about just the numbers involved, let's say whether it's SOC 2 or ISO, you're typically going to have, let's say, 80 to 120 controls in place. Each of those controls, you're probably going to have, let's say, a couple, let's say 2 things you need to go and check. Someone needs to go and check you're actually doing it. They might need to do that daily. They might need to do that quarterly. They might need to do that on an annual basis. But if you just do the numbers, right, that's an awful lot of time spent going and checking and collating evidence and ensuring that you're continuing to do things, let alone actually doing them. So if you can automate that process, it's going to save you a huge amount of time.
Brilliant. All right, perfect. Well, I think that probably brings us to the end of the discussions that we were going to be having today. So hopefully this conversation has helped the audience be able to decide kind of for themselves. Firstly, we obviously covered off, do we need a standard in the first place? If so, which one? And then I guess from this point onwards, now we'll open it up to any questions. I can see that we had one question come through, so I'll kick off with that one first. So had a question come through saying, in ISO 27000, certified auditors audit you, but in SOC 2 an accountant audits you. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So SOC 2, it's a certified public accountant. So they're going to be someone that's associated with the AICPA or CIMA. So yes, it's an accountant that carries out the audit. And it's very much in the similar way that, the frameworks that are in place for writing an audit on financial accounts, they're writing an audit on your company's security controls. With SOC 2, they a lot like ISO 27001. There's different categories of controls. And one probably point worth mentioning is the only mandatory category that you need to consider is kind of called the common criteria, which is around the basic data security controls. So yes, absolutely that. It's an accountant for SOC 2, whereas ISO 27001, it needs to be a qualified auditor. They'll work for a certification body, and in the UK they should be UCAS accredited. Now, a word of warning here, because ISO is just a standard that you can go and buy from their website. In theory, anybody could issue you with an ISO certification. However, your customers will expect you, if you're in the UK, to have been issued that certification by a UCAS accredited certification body, or the equivalent international body, but they are all up to an international standards organization, the IS. But the point here is that there are firms out there that will issue you for a certificate for not a lot of money. And the reason they can do it for not a lot of money is because they don't have to uphold the same level of standards, and they don't really have to go to the same lengths and cost. Therefore, it's much cheaper. The problem you'll have if you go and get you can go down the road and buy your certificate for 10 quid, is that if your customers check, they will not accept that certificate. So in the UK, you need to ensure it's a UCAS accredited certification body that provides you with that certificate. I say there's around a dozen common ones out in the UK.
Brilliant. Hopefully that answered your question, Saeed. If there's any more questions from anybody, feel free to either unmute yourself and come and ask us, or you can pop them in the chat box. Let us know if there's anything else you'd like to ask. I actually had one, in the meantime. We quite often get a lot of communications from our clients saying that they are having to do, when, say, they're pitching for business, they are maybe having to fill out like a sort of security questionnaire, or the different organizations have varying forms of kind of like trust centers or things that demonstrate sort of security controls or posture towards certain things. Does sort of having a certification mean that you might be able to avoid some of this in the future?
I think that if I talk to most of my customers, the biggest pain point they have are the number of questions, and the fact that the questions they receive from their customers are not standard. Customers are all trying to ask the same things, and they're all trying to achieve the same things, that ensure that they're suppliers, but they'll ask the questions in a slightly different way. So I think it's probably the biggest pain point for all our customers. Now, there are things you can do to try and help that. So certificate will absolutely help build that trust. In some cases, it depends on your industry, having a certificate in place will help reduce the number of questions you're likely to receive. And in many cases, when you're going through that procurement process, it might be that if you have, for example, a SOC 2 Type 2 report, they're not going to ask you as many other questions. They're not going to go into as much detail. So that will absolutely help. And the same with an ISO 27001 certificate. They may ask you less. It depends a lot on the industry and the people you're selling to. So, for example, in some industries, they might be happy that you publish a lot of this information proactively on, in our case, it's called a Trust Hub page, where you can proactively publish all your policies and the controls, all this great information, so that customers can just come onto a web page and they can, once they've signed in and you've approved them, they can go and view all this information, which in many cases, a lot of industries, that will absolutely reduce the number of questions you've got. But if you're thinking about health tech, fintech, some of the other sort of more regulated environments, they're typically going to ask you to fill out those questionnaires regardless. It might just be that you get less questions if you've got through certification. And in many cases, they won't even consider you anyway if you don't have certification.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, brilliant. And got some more questions just come in here. So is there a way to map some of the controls between the two standards?
Yes, absolutely. So we do that. And the way we do that is because the controls aren't worded exactly the way across the standards. And particularly when you think of something like SOC 2, where it's quite vague, but they give you guidance on each of the controls. They're not specific about how each control should be the way they aren't specific in the control wording. So what we do is we look at actually what are the underlying things you need to do. So I need to check, for example, that background checks done, and my background checks include that I'm going to check someone's identity. I'm going to do maybe check their educational qualifications, those types. The things you actually need to do, they're the same for all these standards. So what we do is we map those underlying what we call control checks across all the standards. So as you progress from typically the Cyber Essentials and GDPR frameworks, then you'll move up to either ISO or SOC 2. What you're doing is as you progress through each of these frameworks, you're seeing your progress towards the others. So you only need to provide and capture and deliver each of these things you actually need to do once. So yes, absolutely, we map them to make your life easier. So as you've done one, you can see your progress towards, and that's why actually with all our customers, regardless of if they've come to us and they want to go straight to SOC 2 or straight to ISO, we always say, well, that's great. But even if you don't go for certification, it's always good to start with the Cyber Essentials, get through the GDPR frameworks as well, start there, because then these are things that you absolutely fundamentally should be doing anyway. And actually, once you've done them, and you can do them relatively quickly, you'll see a really good progress towards ISO 27001, SOC 2, NIST 2, all the other frameworks that are out there and being added.
Sounds good. We've probably answered this a little bit, but we've just got, so is there one that specifically is better for small and medium-sized companies?
So unless you are specifically selling into North America where they're going to demand SOC 2 Type 2, I would start with ISO 27001. Two reasons: internationally recognized, and if that's where your customer base is, it makes sense to them. And the other one is it's cheaper and takes less time.
There you go. Hopefully that answers the question. Brilliant. Any more questions from anybody? Had quite a few good questions come in. Another one I always get asked is, particularly for both ISO and SOC 2, is pen testing mandatory? Sometimes you hear it is, sometimes you hear it isn't. Do you have an answer to that one?
So with ISO 27001, nothing is mandated in that way. However, increasingly, an auditor would expect you to have it in place because it may be hard to justify, depending on your type of business, of course, and the risk you face. It may be hard to justify why you haven't done that. There's a particular focus in ISO 27001 in the latest version on threat intelligence, ongoing vulnerability scanning, and that includes sort of the broader pen testing type services. So looking for those vulnerabilities, addressing them on an ongoing basis. So it's not mandatory for ISO 27001, but it's expected. And it's very much the same with SOC 2. I don't have any customers of ours that are SOC 2 Type 2 have SOC 2 Type 2 reports that haven't done a pen test. It's right. It's the norm. It's expected. But again, like I say, it's going to be based on the risks your specific business face and whether or not you need to be conducting that. Now, there aren't many firms that are going to be doing SOC 2 Type 2 sort of going through that whole process and getting a report, unless they are unless they're kind of a SaaS company or a data center provider, or they're capturing customer information and processing it. And therefore, if you're doing that, it's pretty hard to justify why we wouldn't have a pen test in place. Now, as you know, and I'm sure you can talk about it, there are different types of pen tests. And again, that's going to be reflective of the nature of risk your business face and the customer data that you're holding, processing, transmitting.
I guess that's the main point, really. You've got to be able to, if you would assume that if you're a security focused organization to be going through one of these certifications, then you would be looking to do pen testing as it's kind of, recommended as an industry standard. But if you're not going to do it, you've got to be able to kind of defend why you wouldn't be doing that based on the kind of context of your individual business.
Exactly. Yeah. So you would have to have a pretty clear reason as to why you feel that that wasn't necessary, and why you've decided A, there isn't a risk associated with it, or B, why you've determined that that risk doesn't warrant carrying out a pen test.
Brilliant. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions I had to ask. Did anyone else have any questions before we let Al shoot off and everyone can go and grab some lunch? No. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for your time today. Just as a reminder, if you do want to try out on security, we're still running our 2-week free trial if you haven't used our scan and radar tools yet. So that's a vulnerability scanner and a threat intelligence tool, which are obviously some sort of fairly fundamental controls within particularly ISO for the threat intelligence, but vulnerability scanning is obviously a pretty important part of any sort of security certification. So you can scan here on our little QR code that we've got here. As we kind of mentioned at the beginning, we would really, really love to hear any suggestions or kind of feedback on next webinar topics you'd like to see covered, anything like that. I know Liv has dropped in a little feedback link into the chat, so hopefully she'll drop that again just so that we can see that again. But if you do have a minute to fill that out, we'd really, really appreciate it. It's really helpful for us moving forward. Yeah, that's all done. So thanks very much, Al. Appreciate your time today and answering everybody's questions. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining, and we hope to see you on the next webinar. Take care.
Thanks, Beth. Good afternoon, everyone. Bye. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.